Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on this show, UPTV, because this is also televised on UPTV. Anyway, this is the second quarantine show from my undisclosed location. It's 1 week of quarantine now. Since last week, I've been spending a lot of time by myself. In fact, all of my time by myself, except for the few moments where the dog and I went for a walk, which we'll probably be doing later today. But it's an interesting time that we all live in. I'm one of the fortunate ones in this instance. A lot of people are really struggling, and not only with health issues, but with money things and job loss and things like that. And my heart goes out to them because these are very tough times for a lot of people, and I wish everyone the very best. Amongst the people that are struggling are immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants at this point, but immigrants across the board are having their own set of problems right now, as everyone else seems to be. So we're all having a hard time, and this will be probably a mostly coronavirus immigration show, but we'll see what all I can find for you today. The first article that I have here is about the healthcare system. It's entitled, "Immigration System Slowdown Keeps Some Doctors from Coronavirus Front Lines." And it reads as follows. From the hospital where he works in South Carolina, Dr. Kiran Nagarajan has been watching the coronavirus crisis explode in other parts of the country. But, like many other immigrant doctors, he can't do anything about it. There's a dire need of physicians, especially in places like New York and New Jersey, Nagarajan said. I wish I could go and help there. But Dr. Nagarajan is here on a temporary visa, one that only allows him to work at the hospital in South Carolina that hired him. He often travels to New Jersey, where his wife works, near the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak. I'm literally doing nothing here, he said, but I can't work. 1 in 4 doctors in the U.S. is an immigrant. 1 in 4. Think about that. That's a pretty high number. 25%. Thousands of them arrive every year to train in the U.S. and stay to work on temporary visas. Many of them, like Naragan, want to be on the front lines of the coronavirus outbreak, but they can't easily transfer their visas to practice in another hospital because U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services has closed offices to the public and cut back on services. Coronavirus is disrupting the immigration system at nearly every level. Green card and citizenship interviews are also suspended. Some immigration courts have closed, but others are still open over the objections of immigration judges and lawyers. And it's not just legal immigrants who are affected. Immigrants in the country illegally are afraid of being deported if they come forward to get tested and treated for coronavirus. We're dealing with those kinds of issues day in, day out, of how you actually continue on when necessary functions in the immigration system are not happening, said Greg Siskind, founding partner of the immigration law firm Siskind Susser, P.C. in Tennessee. Siskind said the USCIS work slowdown means longer processing times for work visas, and State Department actions in response to coronavirus are also having an impact. A huge problem is looming this summer, Siskind said, when 4,000 international doctors are supposed to begin their residencies at U.S. hospitals. But U.S. embassies and consulates worldwide have suspended routine visa processing, so those doctors may not get their visas in time. We're hearing now from teaching hospitals that we represent that are in panic mode, he said. As for undocumented immigrants, President Trump was asked earlier this week if they could show up at testing sites without fear. Trump said, yes, they can. And if that's not the policy, I'll make it the policy, he said. But his administration has been sending mixed signals. Immigration and Customs Enforcement said it is suspending most arrests and focusing only on criminals. Then a top Homeland Security official, our old friend Ken Cuccinelli, emphasized that deportations would continue. Naturally. Advocates say immigrants don't know what to believe. Well, I think you should probably believe Ken Cuccinelli because he represents the true face of the immigration attitude of this current administration. Anyway, that's an editorial aside, but it's the truth. Quote, you can imagine the confusion and terror that's rippling through the immigrant community at this point, said Doug Rand, a former Obama administration official and co-founder of the law firm Boundless Immigration. Some legal immigrants fear that they could become targets of ICE enforcement if their visas expire while immigration offices are closed. Rana Akawi, an immigrant from Lebanon who's teaching at a school in Memphis, she was supposed to get married this weekend to her boyfriend, a U.S. citizen. We had to cancel the wedding. We didn't want to put anyone's life at risk, Akawi said. I'm not regretting it, but at the same time, I'm faced with this reality. What am I going to do? Akawi's visa expires at the end of the school year, so she planned to apply for a green card. But to get it, Akawi still has to get married. Now she's scrambling to find someone who can perform the wedding, and she's finding she can't afford to be picky if she wants to stay here with her husband. My boyfriend and I are both born into Christian families. We don't practice religion, but I might have a rabbi marry me right now, she said with a laugh. I think that story pretty much speaks for itself. Our next story is entitled Judge Urges Release of Migrant Children After 4 Test Positive for Coronavirus in Detention. This is much more serious here. Concerned that thousands of migrant children in federal detention facilities could be in danger of contracting the virus, a federal judge in Los Angeles late on Saturday ordered the government to make continuous efforts to release them from custody. The order from Judge Dolly M.G. of the United States District Court came after plaintiffs in a long-running case over the detention of migrant children cited reports that 4 children being held at a federally licensed shelter in New York had tested positive for the virus. The threat of irreparable injury to their health and safety is palpable, the plaintiffs' lawyers said in their petition, which called for migrant children across the country to be released to outside sponsors within 7 days unless they represent a flight risk. There are currently about 3,600 children in shelters around the United States operated under license by the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, and about 3,300 more at 3 detention facilities for migrant children held in custody with their parents, operated by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Advocates for immigrants have tried for decades to limit the government's ability to detain children apprehended after crossing the border, arguing that it is psychologically harmful, violates their rights, and undermines their long-term health. Now, some say, the coronavirus represents an even more immediate threat. In addition to the 4 children who tested positive in New York, at least 1 child is in quarantine and awaiting results of a test for the virus at a detention facility operated by ICE, according to documents filed with the court. In her ruling on Saturday, the judge declined to order an immediate release of all detained children, given current travel restrictions and the need to ensure that children are released to suitable sponsors, most often family members. She said, however, that both of the agencies operating migrant children detention facilities must, by April 6, provide an accounting of their efforts to release those in custody. Her order will undoubtedly speed up releases, said Peter Shea, co-counsel for the plaintiffs in the court case. Judge G's jurisdiction stems from a 1997 consent decree known as the Flores Agreement that established a 20-day limit on the secure detention of migrant children, as well as standards for their care. In September, Judge G rejected new regulations that would have let the government hold children and their parents in detention for indefinite periods, one of the Trump administration's signature efforts to curtail the large number of families that had been arriving from Central America. In her order, Judge G said the plaintiffs had a strong likelihood of succeeding with their claim that both ICE and the Refugee Resettlement Office had breached the Flores Agreement by failing to release minors in a prompt manner, especially in light of the widening coronavirus outbreak. The court found that the Office of Refugee Resettlement appears to be in substantial compliance with guidelines from the Centers for Disease Control for protecting children from the threat of disease. But it found that ICE, which operates 2 facilities in Texas and 1 in Pennsylvania, appears deficient. What a surprise. The agency had not included social distancing, increased personal hygiene or coronavirus testing as part of its protocol for detainees as of March 15th, when reports were submitted to the court. Nor did it recognize the potential psychological harm of quarantining or isolating children for disease control purposes, the court said, adding that recent observations showed uneven implementation of recommended public health measures. Last week, the Refugee Office said it had halted placements of unaccompanied children in California, New York, and Washington, where there have been large outbreaks of the coronavirus. It also reported that several staff members at shelters for migrant children had been diagnosed with COVID-19. This is a real recipe for disaster here. I'm sure that's apparent to anybody that stops to think about this for more than a moment or two, that holding a bunch of people in confinement, people in prisons, etc., is a bad idea when there is a new virus going around that no one is immune to and everybody can catch very easily. While there may be some argument against releasing people from prisons in large numbers, given the fact that some of those people are likely dangers to themselves and to the community, there is really no good argument for keeping immigrants in custody, given that they are guilty of, basically something about the same to running a traffic light or speeding. That's about the level of the laws that they've broken in terms of seriousness, and yet we're imprisoning them as if they were violent, dangerous offenders, and that's just unconscionable to keep people locked up in close quarters when there's basically a plague going around, a pandemic in effect. But we'll see what happens with that. We'll keep an eye on that story and see where it heads in the future. Okay, next is a story that is about something to do with immigration that affects all of us. And it is entitled, COVID-19 Immigration Restrictions Make Labor and Food Shortages a Real Possibility. Farm groups are warning that immigration restrictions put in place this month by the Trump administration could lead to food shortages down the road. Last week, the U.S. closed consulates in Mexico, which halted processing of farm worker visas there under the H-2A visa program. Earlier reports had suggested H-2A visas would continue to be processed. The U.S. and Mexico also agreed last week to close the border temporarily to all but essential traffic. Though commercial transport and workers with legal work permits are still free to traverse the border. The moves also come as protesters in Mexico blocked a border crossing this week to demand visitors from the United States be tested for the coronavirus before being allowed into Mexico. The H-2A visa program lets U.S. farmers, ranchers, and other agricultural producers that anticipate labor shortages bring on foreign workers temporarily to fill the gaps. Contrary to what some might assume, these visa holders aren't unskilled labor, Higgins writes. Modern farming involves a lot of technology, including heavy equipment, that the workers must be familiar with, as well as other skills that ordinary people won't possess. According to 2016 Labor Department data, more than 165,000 agricultural labor positions were certified that year under the H-2A program. More than half of those positions were based in Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, Washington, and California. Leading crops harvested by H-2A workers include berries, apples, melons, sweet potatoes, lettuce, and corn. More than 9 out of every 10 farm workers holding an H-2A come from Mexico. Let me say that again. More than 9 out of 10 farm workers holding H-2A come from Mexico. That's 90%, in case your math is slow today. While workers who've applied for H-2A visa in the past are eligible to renew, Higgins cites agricultural sources who say such renewals typically account for only around half of annual applicants. Unless many more existing visa holders reapply than normally do, then, or the Trump administration changes course, the U.S. could face crippling farm labor shortages, and those labor shortages could, in turn, translate to food shortages at U.S. grocery stores. According to a primer from the American Farm Bureau Federation, the nation's largest farm lobby, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which gave rise to the H-2 visa process in the early 1950s. The H-2A program has grown dramatically in recent years, with some U.S. businesses that rely on H-2A applicants seeing their demand for guest workers double in recent years. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, acknowledging the potential impact of a farm labor shortage, said the administration will do everything we can to keep that part of our economic lifeblood working. Meanwhile, many are downplaying the risk of any potential food shortages. Even if the COVID-19 pandemic stretches over months, there will be no big food shortages, especially on staples like milk, eggs, cheese, and bread and meat, CNBC reported last week. The New York Times also reported, as did Politico, that domestic food supplies and production are on solid ground. Rodney McMullen, CEO of Kroger, told The Motley Fool that food shortages are unlikely given that there's plenty of plenty of food in the supply chain. But as Forbes reported last week, producers and sellers are facing many challenges, including a number of weak spots in the food transportation system that could be aggravated by the increased demand for food. And though some grocers are thriving right now, they're also struggling to keep up with the consumer demand. Predictably, the U.S. isn't the only country facing food supply hurdles due to COVID-19. Europe, for example, is facing similar labor challenges, which are giving rise to fears of food shortages there, too. COVID-19 has caused countries to take a variety of steps to reassess their food supplies. Some countries, for example, have begun to halt food exports. The Guardian reported this week that the United Nations warns that worker shortages, coupled with protectionist policies, including tariffs and export bans, including ones adopted in Kazakhstan, Vietnam, and Russia, could begin to cause food shortages around the globe within weeks. Global supply chains, like those in the U.S., are also being tested. But these fears aren't universal. Thailand, for one, is downplaying fears of any food shortages in that country. Ultimately, the U.S. could still avoid potential farm labor shortages if, say, the Trump administration reverses course, or less likely, given the need for skilled labor, if recently unemployed U.S. workers fill the available farm positions. The Trump administration's odious stance against Mexico, Mexicans, and immigrants in general casts a cloud of suspicion over its immigration and border restrictions. Vox reported last week that some observers are concerned that the Trump administration is using the crisis as a potential excuse to further restrict travel across the southern border. On the other hand, temporary border restrictions to battle COVID-19 make sense. They also apply at this point to people in every non-U.S. country, whether Canada, Mexico, China, England, or beyond, and vice versa. As soon as those restrictions can be lifted safely and our borders can be reopened, they should be. American farmers and consumers depend on it. So, a potential problem. We'll see what comes of that and whether it turns into anything better or worse than it is, but that's another story to keep an eye on for the future. I think a lot of people who are only vaguely aware of the immigration issue and don't really follow it very much don't realize all the different aspects to it. I mean, we've touched on a couple of them here so far. The doctors and skilled labor. There's a lot of medical personnel that come to this country to study. And most of them, stay here for a while after they have done their studying. Some of them permanently, and some just stay here to get their residency requirements. But our medical system depends very much on those people being able to do that, coming here, learning what they learn, and then being able to stay and work here for a while. So that's the front lines of our medical defense system, our medical defense corps, if you want to look at it like that, that is being stretched thin because of immigration situations and immigration problems. Farm workers is another, it's a huge thing. An enormous part of our farm work force are immigrants who come here. A lot of them are seasonal workers who come, work, and then go back. And if you slow down that process in any way, you create a huge problem for farmers here in America. And it's easy enough to say, well, that's simple. Lots of people are out of work and they'll do that. But how many people do you know, like you yourself, let's say you were out of work right now, would you go to some place in Texas or California to be a manual laborer, basically, and work on the farm and pick strawberries? I couldn't, really, realistically. You know, if my job were to disappear right now, I couldn't go and do that. I have a home here. I have all sorts of things. So it's one thing to have this surplus of labor that is suddenly not working, and another thing to have a place where they need it and people who are willing to go there or able to go there and do that kind of work. And while the numbers might match up, the realities do not match up. And a lot of the people that are out of work are in service industries right now, like restaurants and bars, things where they are based around people coming there and hanging around together to enjoy those services. But that doesn't mean that these are potential farm workers who are going to go out and work in the field for 12 hours a day. So that is another problem that really needs to be addressed, and we need to take a look at that. So moving onward. This story is entitled, Millions of Workers in the U.S. Won't Be Getting Stimulus Checks. When stimulus checks start going out across the country, undocumented immigrants won't be receiving them. That's not a surprise. They aren't eligible for most federal benefits. But immigrants' rights advocates say leaving this group out of the $2 trillion plan isn't merely a matter of dollars and cents, and it isn't something that only affects undocumented workers and their families. It's a dangerous decision, they argue, that puts the whole country's health at risk as the novel coronavirus spreads. Critics counter that it's not the U.S. government's place to bankroll someone who broke the law, and that as unemployment skyrockets, American workers should come first. This isn't just another set of salvos in the political battle over immigration that's raged in our country for decades. It's a very different debate because of who could be impacted and what's at stake. Even though Congress has cast its votes on the stimulus bill, the debate is far from over, and the impact of what's happened so far is only just coming to light. Here's a look at why this issue matters and what could happen next. Unauthorized workers make up about 5% of the U.S. labor force, around 7.6 million people. according to the latest estimates from the Pew Research Center. Advocates argue that coronavirus crisis that's devastated global markets, overwhelmed hospitals, and left millions without jobs is having an outsized impact on undocumented workers. Many had service sector jobs that were decimated by the pandemic. Those who remain employed largely don't have the option of working from home and are risking their safety to keep supply chains going. It's undocumented workers that are still in the fields, still in the factories, still the janitors in the buildings, still looking for work as day laborers, says S.G. Sarmiento, campaign director for the National Day Laborer Organization Network. At first glance, you wouldn't necessarily expect this group to be included in the stimulus deal. After all, they generally aren't eligible for government benefits. And these days, it's rare to see leaders in Washington rolling out the welcome mat for immigrants. But because of the threat the novel coronavirus poses, advocates argue this shouldn't be treated as business as usual. In a public health crisis, they say, if someone feels like they can't miss work or can't afford medical care, that impacts the entire community. From a public health perspective, you cannot have an effective national response to a pandemic that excludes enormous segments of the population. That's both illogical and immoral, Sarmiento says. Stimulus checks aren't the only option on the table. Another thing advocates have been pushing for that wasn't included in the deal lawmakers approved: more access to testing and emergency medical care for immigrants in the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals and Temporary Protected Status programs. The package does not provide enough access to testing and treatment. We just think this is totally irresponsible and dangerous and infuriating, said Tyler Moran, executive director of the Immigration Hub, an immigrant advocacy organization. Everybody's health literally depends on the health of your neighbor. And guess what? Everyone has an immigrant neighbor. Organizations that favor restricting immigration say that now, more than ever, it's clear that undocumented immigrants shouldn't be included in the stimulus package. With one of the worst jobless reports in quite a few years, the primary focus right now should be getting on American workers and lawful immigrants, says Chris Chemensky, deputy director of Numbers USA, an anti-immigrant organization. We should make sure that those people are taken care of first. What about concerns that leaving undocumented immigrants out of the stimulus bill will have a detrimental impact on public health? Chemensky says the aid package includes funding for medical care providers who will test and treat patients regardless of immigration status. Our top priority has to be helping Americans and helping legal permanent residents who are most affected by the crisis, both from a health perspective and economic perspective, he says. Ingrid Vaca says this is her third week without work and there's no end in sight. It's extremely difficult right now. I don't know what I'm going to do. I know I'm not going to have enough to pay my rent, the 57-year-old Virginia housekeeper says. The government is making us invisible. The fact that I'm a person without documents in this country does not mean that I'm not a human being and that I'm not hungry, she says. The government uses us when it needs us. We keep their houses clean. We take care of their children and their elders. And we do it with a lot of love. For decades, Vaca says she's paid taxes every year. Millions of other undocumented immigrants have too. We're just asking for a little grain of sand in return, she says.